I never thought a bridge could be the thing that decides whether you feel free or trapped on your own land. But that's exactly what happened to me. And looking back now, it still feels a little unreal how fast everything spiraled once someone decided my access didn't matter anymore. Or worse, that it was in their way. I live on a stretch of land out past Canyon Ridge in western Montana, 43 acres sitting on the far side of a deep-cut valley, where a seasonal creek runs loud in spring and almost disappears by late summer. And the only reason I ever bought it was because it came with a recorded easement from the late 80s that guaranteed legal access through the neighboring parcel. Not just on paper, but physically through a private steel bridge I built back in 2003, engineered properly, permitted, inspected twice. Nothing improvised or sketchy, just a solid structure connecting me to the county road like it was supposed to. And I never really thought twice about it after that because it just worked. It was just life. Until the day it didn't. The first sign something was off wasn't loud or dramatic. It was actually kind of subtle, almost easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention, because I came home one afternoon and noticed a white utility truck parked near the bridge on the neighbor's side. A guy in a neon vest standing there with a tablet, just staring at the structure like he was trying to memorize it. And when I walked over and asked what was going on, he gave me a polite smile that didn't really reach his eyes and said, "They were just documenting existing infrastructure for a future development plan. Nothing to worry about, just routine." And I remember nodding, but something about the way he kept looking at the bolts and weld points didn't sit right with me. Like he wasn't documenting. He was evaluating. A week later, I met Evan Carlisle for the first time, the development director for a company called North Pine Ridge Partners. And if I had to describe him, I'd say he looked like the kind of guy who had never once in his life had to fix anything with his own hands. Expensive jacket that still somehow looked casual, sunglasses even though it was cloudy, and this calm, practiced voice that made everything sound like it had already been decided and I just hadn't caught up yet. He introduced himself. While walking the edge of my bridge with a surveyor, tapping a clipboard and asking questions about when it was built, what load it could handle, whether I ever had commercial traffic cross it. And I told him straight up it was private access tied to a recorded easement and had nothing to do with his project. And he just smiled and said something like, "Oh, of course. We're just making sure everything around our future site aligns with safety expectations." Then he turned and walked away like I was already background noise. 2 weeks after that conversation, I left early in the morning to pick up supplies from town. Nothing unusual. Just a long list of things I'd been putting off. And I remember thinking as I drove out across the bridge that it felt solid as always. Same slight vibration under the tires. Same sound of steel under weight. Nothing gave me any warning at all. But when I came back that evening just before sunset, I slowed down at the edge of the canyon road and my stomach just dropped because the bridge wasn't there anymore. Not damaged, not blocked, just gone. Like someone had erased it from the landscape. And all that remained were jagged cut steel beams sticking out from my side of the cliff and a clean open drop into the creek bed below. On the far side, I saw heavy equipment, an excavator with its arms still warm from work, and a flatbed truck already loaded with pieces of what used to be my bridge, and I just sat there in my truck for a few seconds trying to make sense of it, because your brain doesn't process something like that immediately. It keeps trying to rewrite reality into something less insane. Maybe there's a detour. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe I took the wrong road. But there was no mistake. And then I saw Evan Carlisle standing there on the opposite bank like he was supervising a delivery, calm as ever, hands in his pockets, watching me. I got out and yelled across the gap asking what the hell they thought they were doing. And one of the machine operators actually stopped and called back that they were instructed to remove an unsafe structure that posed liability risk to the development site. Like it was the most normal sentence in the world. And I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because my brain was overloaded. And I asked Evan directly if he had any idea what he had just done, and he finally raised his voice just enough to carry across the canyon and said they had their engineers evaluate the bridge and it did not meet current standards for guest safety. And since their resort was going to bring public traffic through that area, they couldn't risk it. But don't worry, he said, you're free to construct a new compliant access structure if you'd like. Then he turned away like the conversation was finished. I stood there watching them load the last section of my bridge onto the truck, and I remember the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing through the canyon like it was going to stay there forever. And I took photos, a lot of them, every angle I could think of, because something in me already knew this wasn't just a dispute. This was going to become a legal fight whether I wanted it or not. And by the time I drove the long detour back through the fire roads that night, 15 miles of washed-out gravel and narrow switchbacks that shook my truck the whole way, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was just focused in a very quiet way, like everything had narrowed down to one decision point. And when I finally got cell service again, I called the only person I trusted to handle something like this. An attorney named Marianne Holt, someone who had spent 40 years dealing with property law in this county and had a reputation for being polite right up until the moment she wasn't. I remember her answering late, hearing me out without interrupting, just silence on the line while I explained what happened, and when I finished she didn't ask a single emotional question. She just said, "Send me every document you have on that easement and the bridge permits right now." So I did, sitting in my truck outside my cabin while the engine cooled and the night came in heavy around me. And when she called back maybe an hour later, her voice had changed, not louder, just sharper, more precise, and she said something I didn't forget. She said they didn't just trespass on your land, they destroyed your legal access. And then she paused and added, "This is catastrophic." That's when she told me to stay ready because we were going to court immediately, emergency filing, no waiting, no negotiation. And I remember looking out at the dark canyon thinking about how a structure I barely ever thought about had suddenly become the center of everything. And I didn't sleep that night at all, just waited for morning knowing whatever came next was going to move fast. By the time morning came around, I was already sitting in Marianne Holt's office before the coffee even had a chance to cool. And that place always felt a little intimidating in a quiet way, not because it was fancy, but because everything in it looked like it had been used for decades to win fights people didn't think they could win. Stacks of case files, old county maps pinned behind glass, and a kind of silence that only exists in rooms where decisions actually matter. And Marianne herself didn't waste time on anything emotional. She just spread my documents across the table like she was assembling a timeline of someone else's mistake. Easement from 1987, bridge permits from 2002, inspection clearance from 2 years ago, photos of the demolition, each piece landing in place a little heavier than the last. And she finally leaned back, tapped her pen once against the desk, and said, "I want you to understand something clearly. They didn't remove an obstacle, they destroyed a legally protected access point tied to recorded property rights. And in this county, that's not just a civil issue. That's something judges take personally." I remember asking her if there was any chance they could argue safety and get away with it. And she just gave a small shake of her head like I had asked if the sun could rise in the west. She said, "Not if the permits are what you say they are. Not if there was no condemnation order. And definitely not if they physically dismantled a permitted structure without notice." Then she slid her glasses down just slightly and added, "What they did is the kind of thing developers usually only try once." Within hours, she had filed an emergency petition, and when she said emergency, she meant it. Because by that afternoon, we were already in front of Judge Halden, a man known for being calm in a way that made lawyers nervous, like he didn't need to raise his voice because the weight of his decisions did that for him. The courtroom wasn't crowded, just a few clerks, Evan Carlisle sitting with North Pine Ridge's legal team, and me sitting behind Marianne feeling that strange mix of adrenaline and disbelief that comes when your life suddenly gets translated into legal language, exhibits, filings, statutes. Evan looked confident at first, leaning back slightly. Hands folded like this was just another procedural delay. And when Marianne started speaking, she didn't dramatize anything. She just laid it out clean: recorded easement, permitted structure, inspection clearance. Then she showed the demolition photos one by one, and I still remember the exact moment the room changed because Judge Halden stopped flipping pages, looked up at the screen, then back at the documents, and asked one question very quietly. "There was no condemnation order?" And Marianne said, "No, Your Honor, none." And that was it. That was the point where Evan's posture shifted just slightly. When it was Evan's turn, he tried to frame it as a safety intervention, saying their engineers had flagged the bridge as a liability risk for future public guests, that they had a duty of care, that waiting for government review would have been irresponsible. And I remember him saying it in this smooth, confident tone like he expected it to sound reasonable. But Marianne interrupted once, not loudly, just precise, and said, "You are not the authority over a recorded easement and a permitted private structure." And the judge didn't even look at her when he responded. He just said, "Continue." But the message was clear. Evan then tried something else. He said rebuilding the bridge would take time, engineering review, new standards, budget approval, and he actually used the phrase, "We can't just replicate old infrastructure." And I remember feeling this slow tightening in my chest because I realized he still didn't understand what situation he was in, and Marianne just looked at him and said, "You will restore it exactly as it was, or you will be held in contempt." And the silence after that was heavy enough that I could hear the clerk typing. The judge didn't hesitate. He issued an emergency order right there in court. 72 hours, full restoration of access. Same structure, same specifications, no modifications, and when he spoke there was no anger in it, just finality, like a door closing. Evan tried to argue again after court, catching Marianne in the hallway, lowering his voice like he could still negotiate reality, saying they had contractors lined up, they could build something better, something compliant with resort aesthetics, and I heard Marianne respond without even stopping walking, "You don't get to redesign what you destroyed." And she didn't look at him when she said it. That night, I actually felt something close to relief for the first time. Like maybe it was over before it really began, but I also didn't fully trust it, because people who make decisions like Evan don't usually accept consequences quietly, and I was right about that. 72 hours later, I drove out to the canyon expecting to see construction crews working on the bridge, maybe some sign of compliance. But instead I saw something worse. Nothing, no activity, no equipment, just empty ground and the same open drop where my bridge used to be. And that's when Marianne got the call. Evan had missed the deadline. I remember her face when she hung up. It wasn't surprise. It was more like confirmation of something she already knew was coming. And she said only one sentence. Then we escalate. And we went straight back to court that same afternoon. This time the atmosphere was different, heavier, because the judge didn't ask questions. He already knew the answer. And when Marianne explained the violation of the order, Evan's attorney tried to speak, but got cut off almost immediately, and Judge Halden issued a broader ruling, freezing all North Pine Ridge construction activities, every permit, every foundation, every utility trench across the entire site. Red tags were ordered on everything, and I remember Evan sitting there staring forward. Now without the earlier confidence, like the situation had finally caught up to him in a language he understood. But Marianne wasn't done. She requested a full compliance audit of every permit North Pine Ridge had filed for the resort. And that's where things started to shift from a bridge dispute into something much larger, because once county inspectors got involved, they didn't just look at the bridge situation, they looked at everything, and what they found started to unravel the entire project piece by piece. When the county inspectors finally showed up on the North Pine Ridge site, it wasn't dramatic at first, no sirens, no big announcement, just a few white trucks rolling in early in the morning like it was any other routine compliance check. But within a day, you could feel the tone of the entire project change, because these weren't private engineers anymore working for the developer. These were county officials who didn't care about timelines or marketing brochures or investor promises. They cared about what was actually legal on paper and what wasn't, and that distinction started breaking everything apart piece by piece. The first thing they flagged was the way the resort site plan treated my bridge, or what used to be my bridge, because somehow in their internal documents it had been labeled as future guest parking access infrastructure, which made absolutely no sense legally and immediately raised red flags. And I remember Marianne reading that line out loud in her office, just slowly shaking her head like she couldn't believe someone had actually tried to document something that absurd inside a permit application. Then came the water rights issue, because the creek running through the canyon wasn't just scenery. It was a regulated seasonal water source, and North Pine Ridge's filings conveniently left out how their construction would impact it. Almost like they expected nobody to notice, but the inspectors did notice, and once they started comparing hydrology reports with actual land surveys, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Within another week, they found the septic system design didn't match soil absorption limits, meaning it wasn't just non-compliant, it was structurally unsafe for the environment. And then there were fire access roads that were too narrow for emergency vehicles, something that in a wilderness resort project is basically a deal breaker on its own. Every report that came in didn't just add a problem, it stacked on the last one, like a slow collapse of paperwork that had once looked clean from the outside, but was actually full of shortcuts and assumptions. I remember Evan Carlisle trying to push back at one of the meetings, still holding on to that same controlled tone he had in the beginning, saying things like, "These are standard engineering interpretations, and we can adjust during phase 2. But the inspector just looked at him and said, "There is no phase 2 if phase 1 violates state water and safety codes." And that was the moment I think it really sank in for him that this wasn't a negotiation anymore. Marianne told me later that investors had started calling the company directly after hearing about the freeze order, asking questions no one wanted to answer. And when funding starts getting questioned like that, everything slows down in a very different way. Not legally dramatic, just quietly suffocating. I didn't feel victorious in the way movies would try to make it feel. There was no celebration, no big moment where everything suddenly felt fair. It was more like watching something unstable finally stop pretending it was stable. And I kept thinking about that bridge, not even as revenge or loss anymore, just as this simple structure that used to connect two sides of a canyon, and how quickly everything changed once it was gone. 8 months after the first court hearing, North Pine Ridge filed for bankruptcy, and by then the entire resort project had been erased from the landscape the same way my bridge had been, just in a slower, more bureaucratic way, paperwork instead of steel beams. The last time I went back to the canyon, the air felt the same. The creek still ran when the season allowed it, and the access road still existed, but in a different way now, legally reinforced, impossible to casually ignore. And I stood there for a while thinking about how fragile certainty really is when it depends on people respecting boundaries they didn't build. I never saw Evan again after the collapse, but I don't think about him as much as I think about how close everything came to just being accepted, how easily a single act of destruction almost became permanent if not for the right documents and the right court at the right time. And I guess that's the part one keep coming back to. Not revenge, not victory, just the fact that in the end, the bridge didn't really belong to either of us. It belonged to the law that quietly held everything together until someone decided to test it. And if I'm being honest, I still wonder sometimes what people think they can get away with when they assume nobody's going to fight back in the right way. So I'll leave it with this. If you were the one sitting on that bench as the judge, hearing that case, knowing everything that happened, what would you have done? And do you think what happened here was justice, or just consequences finally catching up?